Across the nation and here in Massachusetts, the calls are growing louder following two controversial grand jury decisions and several other high-profile police-involved deaths.
I can't breathe! I can't breathe! Hands up! Don't shoot! Hands up! Don't shoot! No peace!
There's no question that these protests are a national movement, but will it last and can it lead to real change? Joining me now are Isaac Bornstein, a retired judge who now teaches law at Northeastern and Suffolk universities, and Jocelyn Verterna teaches sociology at Harvard with a focus on social movements and civil society. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Well, Judge, I heard this morning that you're fired up about this.
Well, it's wonderful.
On what level?
On multiple levels, it's wonderful to see people protesting, exercising their First Amendment and other rights, saying enough.
Yeah.
And people are fed up. They see a system of justice that doesn't treat people equally. The deaths are horrible, intolerable, but beyond the deaths, what's going on underneath? Long simmering anger, frustration about a system of justice that isn't fair. 90% of people in prison are African American, Latino, and Asian. 90 to 95% of jurors who convict people are white. The sentencing,
and then there's the whole thing about the law enforcement. They're above the law.
There's a sense that, you know, if you live in a so-called high crime area, you're going to get stopped. You're going to get frisked with very little basis for it. And it's long simmering indignities on a day-to-day basis, and people say enough.
All right, so Justin, we've seen these kinds of movements before, some of them very dramatic civil rights movements in the 60s. We saw the one 3 years ago with Occupy, which actually took hold for like three and a half months, and then it got really cold, and that was kind of the end of that. But is this the kind of thing? I mean, already the protests have petered out. They're still ongoing, but we don't see them with the same kind of regularity.
You know, the social movement scholars have only recently really started to think about when and how social movements matter. And one of the things that they talk about the most is when they're able to make change in terms of policy change or legislation change or institutional change, because those are the kinds of things that we can measure relatively easily. And so the scholarship would tell us that, you know, if the organization is able to really focus in on a target and focus in on specific changes that they ask for, if organizations are able to help in terms of you know, more formal organizations that have professionals who understand litigation and lobbying and the kinds of changes that we need to change political institutions. Sustainability is a key issue if we can maintain public opinion and this public sense of moral outrage over time. And of course, elite allies, you know, people who are willing to champion this in government. All those things are necessary to make some sort of policy change.
But in this case, doesn't I mean, going back to the critical issue here, doesn't law enforcement, we're seeing state police there, I mean, don't they have to acknowledge, I mean, the heavy-handed tactics, the fact that they do target Black, Latino, Asian people more often than, I mean, I wouldn't have been shot and killed if I were Michael Brown. It just wouldn't have happened.
What got attention in New York was a series of New York City, series of class action lawsuits challenging New York stop and frisk. And a courageous judge who made very detailed, lengthy, well-reasoned findings of facts and rulings of law saying stop and frisk in New York basically is targeting African Americans and Latinos and Asians. No, I'm going to find for the plaintiffs here. And it got a tremendous amount of attention, and some change began to get generated. So I agree with Jocelyn. It's how do you get the elite institutions, including the courts, to pay attention, and then that may filter down to law enforcement. You also have a mayor in New York who settled the case, came in with a different attitude.
He's married to an African American.
Exactly. His own life experience has opened him up to this. I actually think in many ways it's like when the Vietnam War reached the suburbs because of the draft that you got the change.
I read some of your work, Justin, too. You say sometimes, I mean, depend what genders are involved. I mean, a lot of women are involved in this movement. A lot of white people are involved in it. It's not just, so does that matter? The more diverse the movement, the more likely it is to have some meaning?
I think that's a really critical part. I think, you know, again, what scholars talk about is sort of how to make policy change, but what we really haven't studied or understood is how to change people's opinion, how to change cultures, how to change you know, understandings of how white privilege works in a society. And the fact of the matter is we live in a society that has racial discrimination on an endemic level, right? You know, that seems to be debated in the media today, but from You know, you read the work of sociologists Larry Bobo, Diva Pager. You know, we know discrimination is endemic in everyday interactions in society, and until we figure out how to target those kinds of identity changes, I think, you know, the institutional changes are critical, but the people who run that institution, the people who enforce the laws, we still need to really work on
How do you
that.
answer this, though, Judge, when law enforcement, Bill Evans and others say, yeah, but 90% of the crime in the city happens in 2 or 3 neighborhoods. That's where law enforcement is. And oh, by the way, those people happen to be African American.
Well, I happen to think that the statistics are skewed. I think it's an image we have that 90% of the crime happens in certain neighborhoods.
I threw that figure out there, but I think it's about right.
Well, I dispute that, and there's studies that suggest that, in fact, there's a lot of crime that happens in suburbs that is easier to cover up, less attention paid to it, and minor offenses. If you include minor offenses, you're going to have a lot more crime in certain areas that you target. If you think about what brought Gardner together with the police in Staten Island,
I know.
selling
cigarettes. I know.
You think that doesn't go on in the suburbs, the selling of individual cigarettes? It's just nobody gets stopped for that. So it's who you target and who you think should be stopped for criminal behavior, which is part of the inequality. You're picking on us.
Yeah.
You're calling us within a zone of a high crime rate because it makes it easier to justify it.
Judge Bornstein, pleasure to have you. Jocelyn
Pleasure
Paterno,
to be
thank
here.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.